Collector. Keep up the good work, and I might not tattle on you. I don't really want you to get arrested. Not yet, at least. This is a special side project just for me. Governor Dukes doesn't know about this, so I was embarrassed at our last encounter, and I want to capture my dear brother as a gift for him. He does not suffer fools or losses, and I need to get back in his good graces. I know a lot of your group's secrets, but wouldn't the leader of a cell be a wonderful present? And I would get back at him for what he did to me. I knew he would not be able to resist the weekend box, and of course, he did not come himself. If I can keep you going long enough, maybe you will draw him out. I'm sure he must be very nearby. Now, let's get on with it. Your next clue. Was it hit by a tornado, or was it a hurricane? If you think it is real, you must be insane. It does look quite odd, but I heard it is fun. You only have 10 minutes, Collector. You had better run!
As cities grew during the industrial era, this Gilded Age, they took different shapes than they had in previous eras. The first generation of cities tended to be the colonial-style city, and they tended to be based on trade. Places like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, even Charleston to some extent, were centers of trade, and only about 5% of the population lived there. The rest of the 95% were rural farmers. And as time went on, new technologies allowed cities to develop in different areas, and they tended to become cities based around transportation. For example, Chicago was a central hub for everything in the United States, connecting the East Coast, the West Coast, the North, and the South, and it tended to be based around the railroad train. So as railroads grew, these central hubs emerged, and people would transport through there. The third generation of cities is our more modern city, and this occurs around the Gilded Age, a little bit after. These cities are industrial cities. The factories grow, people have to live next to their jobs, and cities emerge in this way. Technology allows these industrial cities to grow in places both unexpected and in new ways. For example, cities could now rely on electricity for power rather than water source. So they didn't have to grow near streams. They didn't necessarily have to be in a central transportation hub. You could get electricity and build your factory, and you could build it in an unexpected location. The cities are able to grow as well because of new technology. Cities can grow upwards and they can grow outwards. The outward style of growth is spurred on by new technologies such as the suspension bridge, which allows larger bridges to form, like the Brooklyn Bridge, the elevated train, which allows trains to go over the cities, subways, like in New York City, which allows trains to go under the city, and trolleys, like the San Francisco trolleys. These technologies allow people to live further away from their jobs and then go into the city for work, commute to work. Cities can also grow upwards. These technologies are similar to the steel girders of Andrew Carnegie. A lighter building material means they can grow higher, and you can start stacking people on top of each other. You build buildings higher, and then you can also build things like elevators so that they will actually live in those locations. And this is going to be very important because as time goes on, we have more migration and immigration into cities. During this period of urbanization, cities were growing in population, and there are a number of different reasons for this. One of the large reasons was migration, not immigration, but migration, which is people moving within the country from place to place. And the people were migrating from rural areas and they were moving to the urban areas. And there's a couple reasons for this. The first is the simple law of supply and demand. Because of new farm technologies like the tractor, farmers were making a surplus of goods. And with this surplus of goods, the farmers were actually earning less than they thought that they would. Part of the reason for this is you increase the supply of something, demand stays the same, you get the price is worth less. So farmers were losing their farms, they were losing their profits, and less people were needed on the farms. So technology was replacing farmers. Instead of 10 guys working a field, you could buy a tractor and have one person work in the field. There's also a cultural reason for this. Cities are much more exciting, and some of those farmhands, young men and women, were lured to the cities by the nightlife, the bright lights, the big city. This is different than the immigration issues, which we'll talk about soon.
Something is wrong, isn't it, Ted? If we can get to the parking lot near the aquarium, we'll get out of here. Wait, here's the last mark outside the Liberty Steakhouse. Dot dash. This has to be a message. Who are the other marks? Is this some kind of code?
During the Gilded Age and later in the Progressive era, we can see that there's two different types of immigrants moving into the cities. The pre-Civil War immigrants were known as the old immigrants, and they tended to be from Northern and Western Europe. Irish, Germans, English. They tended to look similar to the old Americans that were there. However, that doesn't mean that they were accepted readily. In the pre-Civil War era, and even a little bit during the Civil War, the Irish and the Germans were characterized as uneducated drunks. There was a large amount of nativism that was involved with this. People that were already living in the United States were afraid that these immigrants were going to come over and ruin the American way of life. After the Civil War, though, there is a new group of immigrants that comes into the country known as the new immigrants. Very confusing. The new immigrants tended to come from Southern and Eastern Europe, places like Italy, Poland, Russia, and there's a large contingent of Jewish population coming to the country. So based on a number of stereotypes, a number of fears, those native-born Americans, sometimes consisting of those very same Irish and Germans that had assimilated, turned against the new immigrants, partially because there was just so many more of them. They came over at about 4 to 5 times the amount of the old immigrants. They tended to be from poor areas. They tended to be uneducated. They didn't have a whole lot of experience with democracy. So the fear was that these new immigrants would come over and they looked different. They ate weird food. They dressed differently. There was a fear that they wouldn't assimilate into our culture. This fear was only enhanced by the fact that they tended to move into ethnic neighborhoods. When they moved to the cities, they tended to be poor, so they didn't have enough money to move and buy a farm or to go far beyond the port where they landed. So in places like New York City or San Francisco, we can see that these large communities develop based on a singular ethnic identity. Places where, if you're Italian, you'd move to New York City and you'd move to Little Italy, and you could buy the food you were used to buying. You could read newspapers in your Italian language. You could go to schools, send your kids to schools where they spoke Italian and taught Italian history. So these ethnic neighborhoods develop in the cities, and they also tended to be very poor. They tended to be what we refer to as tenements. Places today would probably refer to as the ghetto, very poor, a lot of crime, a lot of fire danger, a lot of sickness and disease. And there were some efforts to limit the amount of immigrants coming in and limit their voting rights, but really that doesn't occur until after World War I in the 1920s. The rise of the ethnic neighborhood and the immigrants into the cities gave way to political machines. Political machines are a system in which the city, because it was broken up into ethnic neighborhoods, would often have somebody called a political boss. The boss would arrange for each little ethnic neighborhood, sometimes called a ward, to have a politician that would be elected and then would owe allegiance to that political boss. Now, this gets a little complicated because the people that lived in the ethnic neighborhoods were allowed to vote. And they tended to vote for people that would provide them jobs or housing or had been loyal to them when they had first moved to the country. So this isn't outright bribery, which is sometimes how this is characterized, with the political bosses using money or bribes in order to get people to vote for them. People got elected because they provided services for their constituents or the people that voted for them. The political bosses themselves tended to be corrupt. Boss Tweed in New York City once built a building that was supposed to take about $500,000 to build, and he built it about $20 million or so. So they did tend to be corrupt, but they did try to fix urban issues as well. Things like housing issues, sanitation conditions, water issues, crime, fire prevention. These were issues that the political machines did try to fix, even though they did have that tendency towards corruption. One of the issues with the political machines is that the white middle-class population was frustrated that their tax money was being used to help fix immigrant issues. They also thought that they could fix the problems better than these political machines. This is going to give rise to what's known as the progressive movement. Progressives did want to take the power back for themselves for a number of different reasons, so they started to restrict the power of immigrants and the recently immigrated to vote. They start using things like the Jim Crow laws used against African Americans in the South against the immigrants in the North or in the cities. Things like the poll tax, the literacy test are going to be used against immigrants in order to take their voting rights away. All of this is done in the name of breaking up the political machines.
Oh, very good. Getting to the Wonderworks so fast, Collector. In 10 minutes, I'm going to bring the log back up to full strength. And if you, little old you, are still stealing our Wi-Fi, it will send a report to my office. And you know, there just happens to be a patrol scheduled to run a routine check in the Wonderworks Cafe in, oh, that's right, 9 minutes. You better hurry.
During the industrial era, this Gilded Age, there was a movement called the Great Migration. This is when African Americans moved from the South either to the West to buy land or, more importantly for us, to urban areas, especially in the North. Right after the Civil War, remember, most of the freedmen stayed in the South, typically right on the same plantation where they had been slaves. They had fallen into sharecropping agreements, which were difficult for them to get out of. But over time, there are a number of push and pull factors which led to this great migration. A push factor is something bad that's happening in the area where they were, which made them want to leave. These were things like poor cotton yields. The cotton just wasn't growing at the same rate it used to. A couple of reasons for this. Part of this is soil exhaustion. Some of this is from a parasite known as the boll weevil, which would destroy cotton crops. And because of the sharecropping agreements, bad cotton yields meant that there was more debt that they had to run away from. Also, remember, this is the era of the Jim Crow laws in the South, so they were legally discriminated against. This is de jure discrimination. Also, if they tried to step up and gain any rights for themselves, they were often subjected to the KKK and lynchings. So they were running away from that actual physical violence as well. There are a number of pull factors in the cities, the biggest one being the job openings. Remember that in this era, the reason that they wanted to leave was because of debt, so they wanted to go get jobs, so they would move north, especially during World War I and the time period leading up to World War I. A lot of job openings there. This does not mean that it's great in the cities. There was discrimination. They tended to be the last hired and the first fired when necessary. They tended to be used as strike breakers, which caused a lot of resentment among the white working population. And also, they tended to be sent into segregated neighborhoods. Think of like Harlem in New York City. This does, however, later on lead to a cultural renaissance, especially in Harlem in the 1920s, known as Harlem Renaissance. The Gilded Age gives way to the Progressive era, which means we have to understand what a progressive is. The standards define a progressive as a concerned citizen that formed civic groups in response to the urban problems and the workplace issues of the 19th century, the Gilded Age. Well, in practice what this is a white middle class that's very angry about their taxes being used to try to solve urban issues because of the fear that that money is going simply to corrupt political bosses, the political machines. They're also upset that their money is being taken away and given to those undesired and undesirable immigrants, those new immigrants that were coming from the southern and eastern territories, the Poles and the Italians and the Jewish people and the Russians. So they figured that they should form these civic organizations, they should try to take that voting rights away from the political machines, and besides, they could figure out better ways as a white middle class voting population to fix these issues. One important thing to remember about the progressives, they did not think the government was bad. In fact, they thought that the government could do very good things, as long as you got the right people in there. They thought that the government could be a force for good.
I got it. It's an old code people used to use back before telephones. I think it's called Morse code. Back in the Gilded Age, they used it to communicate through telegraph machines. Did the recordings make you think of that? Brilliant, 10. Dang it. I need to go find the other marks.
The progressive era was intensified and fed by a new media environment. Cheaper paper, new printing techniques allowed mass production of newspapers, just like the other industries, which meant that these journalists that could go out into the world were getting more exposure. And what they chose to look into were the issues of the day. Known as muckrakers, a derogatory term given to them by Teddy Roosevelt because they were always digging up the muck. The journalists would investigate corporations and conditions and point out some of the problems of the Gilded Age society now transforming into the Progressive era. They would point out the corruption of political machines like Thomas Nast in Boss Tweed's New York City. They would look into the power of monopolies like Ida Tarbell and point out the bad things that the monopolies were doing and seeking new antitrust legislation. They would expose the plight of Native Americans, or they would show the fight of the working class, and you had a large amount of socialists that emerged during this time period. Or they would, oddly enough, they would actually point out the problems immigrants were facing in these ethnic neighborhoods and urban areas. I know in the last time we've talked about the idea that the progressives didn't want their money going to the immigrants, but they did want to help the immigrants. They just thought they could do it better than the political machines. Now, the thing about the muckrakers is that they exposed all of these issues, but because they're progressives, they think that the government can do good things. The muckrakers would expose the issue, and then they would expect the government to try to solve a problem to fix it. The best example of this is Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair went into a meatpacking industry, and he wrote a book called The Jungle, which exposed all of the issues going on with that industry. Now, he anticipated it as a work to show the plight of the working class, but when people read the book, what they saw was all the stuff that was going into their meat, rotten meat, rat droppings, all this other not good stuff. And what happened was the people read this work, and they demanded the government action to make sure that they were getting safe meat. It led the government to create the Federal the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, which we still have today. The Progressive era is also a key element in the women's suffrage and later women's rights movements. This goes all the way back, the idea of women's suffrage and women's equality, to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, led by, of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and all those predecessors to the Progressive era. The movement intensified in the post-Civil War era, largely because more women had been getting higher education, being able to go to colleges. Women had been into the factories, they had been into offices. With more job opportunities, there was a realization that they wanted to have more say in politics. They were also frustrated, those that had the higher educations but couldn't get jobs. They wanted more equality so they could actually use that education. Also, the westward expansion era helped out with women's equality quite a bit, and the women's suffrage movement as well, because of the pioneer spirit. Not only the rugged individualism idea of pioneer life, but the fact that husband and wife were working together as a team, and each one of them had to pull their own weight, otherwise the family would not survive. So with westward expansion, this idea that women were important and were equals becomes more vital. In fact, Wyoming is the first state in the Union to give women the right to vote on a state-by-state basis. And in fact, most Western states gave women the right to vote before Eastern states did. So the women's suffrage movement was intensified during this progressive era.
Collector, were you finished or did you just not want to get caught? Well, I have one more clue for you. Oh, don't you trust me yet? All the fun we're having. But I'm getting quite bored now. Just go to the baseball stadium across the street. Maybe you'll get the last of your information. Or maybe it's a trap. I guess you'll just have to take a chance. You know, life is all about taking chances.
One of the major issues of the progressive era was women wanting the right to vote. Known as suffragettes, these women tended to be middle-class white women that were frustrated that they had no say in the issues of the day, things like solving the urban issues or the workplace problems. They tended to argue that their maternal nature would allow them to desire cleaning up society. They opposed the liquor industry. They opposed gambling. They opposed the political bosses. And the argument was that if they were allowed to vote, they would naturally vote for people that would clean up these issues. So there's a lot of opposition. We need to be careful, though. It wasn't just white women that were fighting for this. There was a group of women, African-American women known as the National Association for Colored Women that were fighting for civil rights, which along with that would have been suffrage rights. Typically, we think of two different leaders. The first was Carrie Chapman Catt, though, who was a woman that wanted to lobby on a state-by-state basis for the right to vote. So every individual state would pass a law that allowed women the right to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt formed the National American Women's Suffrage Association to work on this lobbying. The problem was not all women were happy with the state-by-state process. It took a long time. If you were in a state that didn't allow it, you had no recourse. So there was a split in this tactic. One of the people that led the charge at a national amendment was known as Alice Paul. Alice Paul started a party known as the National Women's Party, and they wanted a national amendment to be passed, which would force states to give women the right to vote. Paul led marches and protests, and she even picketed outside of the White House during the Wilson administration during World War I. For her efforts, her and her fellow suffragettes were often attacked physically by men who didn't want women to get the right to vote. They were arrested, especially Alice Paul and her fellows outside the White House, and they were put in prison for weeks, months at a time. They went on hunger strikes to try to publicize their issues. The jailers didn't want them to die in prison, so they force-fed them with these big tubes shoved up their noses and into their stomachs. And these force feedings were horrible. Alice Paul underwent psychiatric evaluation because people thought she was insane for wanting the right to vote and that she was obsessed with Wilson. So the big issue during this era for women was gaining the right to vote, and that's going to lead into further civil rights efforts after they get to the right to vote in 1920. The efforts of Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul and others like them paid off in 1920 after World War I with the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. The efforts of those activists in the previous discussions were a huge stepping stone towards the 19th Amendment. But so wasn't World War I itself, because women played a vital role in the war effort. Women acted as nurses. They stepped up and took roles in factories when the men went off to war. They took roles in the government. They were active in taking care of the home front. So the passage of the 19th Amendment meant that democracy was expanded. However, as women gained the right to vote, they did not use it the way that they thought that they would. Few women ran for office, which limited the exposure. They also tended to vote the way their husbands did, which limited the impact of the suffrage rights. And in a more general idea, the idea of civil rights, women were still discriminated against in the workplace and did not have the equality that they thought would come with gaining the right to vote.
Let's see, on Google it says dash dash dot dot, that's Z. A single dot, that's an E. You talking about me? Are you leaving me a message? Dot dash dot dot L? Dash dot dot D, and I bet, yeah, dash dot is an A. Zelda, is she here, 10? Oh no, I lost track of you. I had to leave you to get the code. How do I get to you, 10? I'll find you. Hold on.
During the Progressive era, some women did do more than just fight for suffrage rights and were more active in the progressive movement. One example of this is Jane Addams. Jane Addams was a highly educated woman who went into the community to try to change things. Remember that she is a progressive, which means she thought that the government could do good things and did try to help get laws passed that would help protect immigrants and others. She's most famous for starting Hull House, which was the beginning of a much larger movement known as the Settlement House movement. These were large houses that would provide things like vocational training to immigrants in an ethnic neighborhood. They would provide English lessons. They would provide child care for immigrant children, so their parents, when they went off to work, they wouldn't just be stuck at the house or running around the neighborhood. Naturally, what's going to happen during these situations is that these immigrants are going to learn American styles of games and language development, and it's going to help ease the process of assimilation for these groups. Jane Addams also helped fight for child labor laws, again, providing vocational training for the parents and also daycare for the children. But more importantly, she wanted to keep children out of the factories. So she fought for laws that would, along with others, that would limit the amount of hours children could work, which did pass, and tried to improve the conditions of the factory for the children if they had to work there. These groups and women like Jane Addams were instrumental in getting the first federal child labor laws passed, which meant that children couldn't work in the factories. Later, interestingly, this is going to be overturned by the Supreme Court, though, saying that it was a violation of the child's right to work. Similar laws are used today, arguing that to deny somebody the right to work is actually a violation of their civil rights. The Progressive era would not have been as notable had it not been for Teddy Roosevelt, the first true modern president and really the first true progressive to hold national office. We need to first remember that Teddy Roosevelt was unelected to his first term. He was the vice president when William McKinley was assassinated in 1900. He's going to hold office for 8 years, however. And he is a progressive, thinking that the government can do good things. They can pass laws to help fix social problems. He responded to a number of muckraker issues, and we'll talk about those here. He was notable for supporting workers' rights. During a coal miners' strike, he actually threatened to use the military against the mine owners, forcing them to negotiate. He told the mine owners that he would nationalize or take over the mines and use the military to work the mines if the owners did not did not negotiate with the workers. Roosevelt called this a square deal. He just wanted a fair deal for the workers, and then so that they wouldn't be dominated by the industrialists. This is really the turning point away from the Gilded Age, where the government had always protected the owners over the working class. He increased the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission to help the farmers. He's going to be known as a trust buster. Remember, one of the big issues of the progressives was the difficulty of having powerful monopolies. So Teddy Roosevelt became known as a trust buster, meaning he tried to break bad trusts and heavily regulated trusts that he saw as good. He did this using the government's Sherman Antitrust Act, which would break bad trusts and regulate the good ones. He protected consumers, especially after reading The Jungle. He passed a law, or helped push through a law known as the Food and Drug Administration, or the Food and Drug Act, which gave us the administration. So a lot of the muckraker issues, Teddy Roosevelt really did try to find ways to fix the problems. He was also a conservationist. He wanted to protect natural resources against the encroachment of corporations, which led to the creation of many of our national parks we still have today, like Yellowstone. He does have a few issues. He retired in 1908, gave the presidency over. He was so popular, he basically named his successor, William Taft. He didn't like how Taft was handling things, so Teddy Roosevelt did run for office again in 1912, creating the Bull Moose Party, a progressive party. He split the ticket between Taft, who was running for re-election, and himself. So the Republicans, that if they would have voted for one guy, they lost the election to the Democrats, Woodrow Wilson. So Teddy Roosevelt, our first real progressive president.
I see you. Go in by gate A. Do you have a lookout with you? By now I should have seen someone following you across the street. Oh, I hope it's dear brother. We can have a family reunion.
After Teddy Roosevelt split the ticket in 1912, Democrat Woodrow Wilson took office. Wilson is going to be much more progressive in the sense that he's going to try to use laws to change things the way that he thinks that they should be. Wilson was pro-labor unions, so he passes something known as the Clayton Antitrust Act. The Clayton Antitrust Act exempted unions from the Sherman Antitrust Act. Corporations had learned how to use the antitrust legislation to break unions. So Clayton allowed unions to exist. In fact, Samuel Gompers, the head of the American Federation of Labor, called this the Magna Carta of labor. Woodrow Wilson was also instrumental in getting the 16th Amendment passed, which was a progressive income tax. Imagine that. People actually wanted an income tax. He was helped push through the 17th Amendment, which was the creation of the direct election of senators. Notice how each of these two or three things was an effort to take big money and corporations out of power and give some of that democracy back to the people. Wilson was also instrumental in passing the First Child Labor Act. He helped create the Federal Reserve, which is sort of the bank for bankers. This was an effort to address the desire of farmers to have a more elastic money supply. Remember, during the populist campaigns, farmers wanted to have more inflation using the bimetallism system. Now, the Federal Reserve wouldn't allow free coinage of silver, but it does take us off the gold standard a bit, and later, after the Great Depression, entirely. So the Federal Reserve is important for controlling economic conditions. He also pushed for more credit for farmers, an 8-hour workday. He's also instrumental in pushing through the workers' compensation plan. Now, it wasn't all great with Woodrow Wilson. He also resegregated a lot of the federal government after Teddy Roosevelt had taken steps away from that. And there are issues with Wilson's other racism. We're going to talk about him again later with the Birth of a Nation. So it's not all roses and buttercups with Woodrow Wilson, but he did try to use the government to solve some of those problems the progressives were really concerned with.
I can't find you, 10. I need to contact Gamma, but that might trigger the cell phone trackers and alert the Jacks. Look, you have 5 minutes to find your way back to the aquarium, and then I'm bringing in the specialist. I really don't want to risk anyone else, so please, get to the aquarium if you can.
World War I really led to the end of the progressive era. There's a number of reasons for this. First of all, there was no real progressive legislation passed during World War I, even though Wilson was still in office. Also, there's a large fear of the other foreigners, especially Germans that either were recent immigrants or actually immigrants in the country. This also led to a large amount of individual rights being overturned. The fear that not everyone was fighting on the same side within the country meant that individual rights were taken away. Also, there's a large grain shortage in the country, and combining that with the anti-German propaganda, Germans tended to be the major brewers in the country. So the passage of the 18th Amendment, the Prohibition Amendment, was seen as a way to hurt any potential German immigrants that would have been supporting Germany during the World War I. This was a long-term goal of the progressive movement, and once it was reached, it really tamped down a lot of the spirit of the movement, but also it proved to be such a disaster after the war that the idea that the government could pass laws that would do good things and that could actually be supported was undermined by the 18th Amendment itself. The 19th Amendment was passed after the war, which was a progressive goal. However, the fact that it was largely ineffective in cleaning up the liquor industry and the political machines also disillusioned many of the former progressives. The idea of progress itself, the idea that things are getting better, was largely killed off by the war itself. World War I occurred after 20 years of the progressive movement, and the idea that things were getting better ran into 20 million deaths. An entire generation of young men in Europe was gone, and this was after supposed progress. So the post-war spirit, while there was some goals, the 18th Amendment, the 19th Amendment were reached, the post-war spirit was not one of progress. There was also this fear of internationalism, and in the 1920 election, Woodrow Wilson, his Democratic Party was defeated by the Republican Party, largely because the Republicans wanted to stay away from internationalism, and what you're going to find is the League of Nations, which would have gotten the United States potentially involved in other international affairs. Now, when the voting population wanted to stay out of the internationalism, and they voted for the Republicans, they also brought in the Republican laissez-faire economic system of that era, which was largely the idea that the government should stay out of people's lives and that they should stay out of the economy. So this idea of the progressive element of using the government to help protect people largely goes away until Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal in the 1930s.
See, you knew that you could trust me. Oh, you performed well, and you were rewarded. If you want a better job, you can always defect and join me. My brother was never stable. He was the worst motivation. Truth and justice, ugh! Well, since I see he sent you here all alone, you are free to go. Take the recordings, use them wisely. I have much bigger game to catch. Let my brother know I'm looking for him. Oh, and the mission is done. This was quite fun. The locks are back up, and if you try to access any more data, they will alert my officers. Or I might be bluffing you. Bye-bye, Collector.
10! 10! I see you coming back. What were you doing across the street? Never mind. Wave your hand if you're okay. Thank goodness. Look, get back here. We gotta get out of here.
Like the other cells, you see their heads hung low. You are the next executioner, and this block known as death row. You walk slowly down the corridors, someone is praying for your soul. And you can hear the silence behind you because you are reaching the final goal.